The stars looked different now that Jake Morrison knew he was not alone among them. The commander of the exploration ship UES Horizon stood on the bridge watching the blue sun of the Kepler system grow larger on the main screen. 3 months had passed since they left Earth, and Jake still could not believe what they had found out here in the deep black of space. The first contact had happened near the 4th planet of this system. Jake and his crew were running routine scans when their sensors picked up something that should not have been there. A ship unlike anything humans had ever built was waiting for them in the shadow of the gas giant's largest moon. The vessel was sleek and silver with flowing lines that looked more grown than built. Dr. Lisa Warren had been the first to suggest they try to make contact. She was the mission's expert on alien life and had spent years dreaming of this moment. When the strange ship responded to their radio signals with mathematical patterns, Jake knew their world had changed forever. The beings inside that ship called themselves the Zithari, and they had been watching Earth for a very long time. Captain Ryan Brooks had wanted to be careful. He was Jake's second in command and a good soldier who always thought about danger first. But the Zithari had not come to fight. They came with an invitation that would shake humanity to its core. They wanted to take Jake and his crew to meet the rulers of the galaxy. The Galactic Council was older than human civilization. 12 different species from across the stars had formed this group to keep peace and help younger races grow. The Zithari explained that Earth had been on their watch list for centuries. They had seen humans discover fire and build cities and reach for the stars. Now they thought it was time for humanity to join the larger community. Jake had agreed to the meeting even though he knew it meant leaving human space behind. The Horizon followed the Zithari ship through something called a jump gate that bent space itself. One moment they were near Kepler, and the next they were in a system with 3 suns and space stations bigger than cities. The council chamber was a massive sphere that floated in space between 2 of the suns. Inside, Jake met beings that looked like walking trees and others that seemed made of living crystal. There were creatures with 6 legs and 4 arms and others that floated in tanks of glowing liquid. Each species had evolved on different worlds, under different suns, but they had all learned to work together. The council's leader was an ancient being called the First Speaker. She looked like a tall human woman, but her skin was silver and her eyes held the wisdom of thousands of years. She welcomed Jake and his crew with words that made his heart race with excitement and fear. The galaxy was vast and full of wonders, but it was also dangerous. The first speaker told stories of species that had destroyed themselves with war or greed. She spoke of others that had tried to conquer their neighbors and been stopped by the council's combined might. The rules that kept peace were simple but firm, and every species had to follow them. Dr. Warren asked many questions about alien science and culture. She learned that some species could live for thousands of years, while others burned bright and fast like candles in the wind. The diversity was amazing, but Jake could see worry in the eyes of some council members when they looked at the humans. A representative of the Vortani species pulled Jake aside after the formal meeting. The Vortani looked like giant insects with 4 arms and compound eyes. Their ambassador spoke in a voice like breaking glass and told Jake something that made his blood run cold. Humanity reminded them of another species that had once sought to join the council. Those beings had been called the Devourers, and they had brought nothing but death to the galaxy. Captain Brooks heard this warning, and his hand moved toward his weapon. The Vortani noticed and made a sound that might have been laughter. They explained that humans showed the same rapid growth and aggressive nature that had marked the Devourers in their early days. The galaxy had barely survived that first encounter, and many species were not eager to risk another. Despite these fears, the Council voted to give humanity a chance. They would be allowed to join as provisional members, but with strict limits. Human ships could only travel to certain systems, and human colonies were forbidden in large sections of space. Any sign of aggressive expansion would result in immediate expulsion from the galactic community. Jake accepted these terms knowing he had little choice. Humanity needed allies among the stars, and this was their only chance to gain them. As the Horizon prepared to return to Earth with news that would change everything, Jake wondered if his species was ready for the responsibility that came with joining something larger than themselves. The journey home felt longer than the trip out even, though it took the same amount of time. Jake spent hours staring out at the stars, knowing that most of them now had names and that many sheltered worlds full of thinking beings. Humanity was no longer alone, but they were also no longer free to do whatever they wanted among the stars. When Earth appeared on their screens, Jake felt a mix of joy and sorrow. Home looked so small and fragile hanging in the black. Soon the blue world would learn that the universe was bigger and stranger than anyone had ever imagined, and that humanity's future depended on proving they were worthy of their place among the stars. 6 months had passed since Jake Morrison returned to Earth with news that changed everything. Now Lieutenant Colonel Amy Peterson walked through the corridors of Kepler Station, wondering if humanity was making a terrible mistake. The space station orbited a neutral world at the edge of Council space and served as humanity's first embassy to the galaxy. Amy had been sent here to keep the peace, but peace seemed to be the last thing on anyone's mind. The human section of the station buzzed with activity that worried the alien residents. Traders from Earth brought goods that amazed and sometimes frightened other species. Human music played too loud in the recreation areas, and human laughter echoed through halls designed for quieter beings. Worst of all, human explorers kept pushing at the boundaries the Council had set for them. Sergeant Danny Walsh met Amy at the docking bay when her transport arrived. Danny had been a Marine before joining the diplomatic security team, and he still carried himself like a soldier ready for war. His first words made Amy's heart sink into her stomach. 3 human trading vessels had been detained by Kethmori. Patrol ships in the Outer Rim, and tensions were rising fast. Ambassador Helen Martinez ran the embassy with the skill of someone who had spent years dealing with difficult people. She welcomed Amy with coffee that tasted like home and news that tasted like trouble. The Kethmori were a warrior species that valued strength above all else, and they saw humanity's rapid expansion as a direct threat to their territory. The main problem was not the government ships or military vessels. Those followed Council rules and stayed within the boundaries set for human exploration. The trouble came from private citizens who bought old cargo ships and headed for the frontier, looking for adventure and profit. They ignored Council protocols and alien customs in their rush to see new worlds and make new deals. Amy spent her first week on Kepler Station meeting with alien officials who all seemed to have the same complaint about humans. The 10th ambassador showed her recordings of human traders trying to sell weapons to primitive species in violation of Council law. The Velkar representative presented evidence of human miners strip mining asteroids and protected systems without permission from local authorities. Each incident was small by itself, but together they painted a picture of humanity as a species that could not be trusted to follow rules. Amy tried to explain that most humans were good people who just needed better education about galactic law, but she could see doubt growing in alien eyes with each new report. The situation became critical when news arrived from the frontier world of New Boston. The colony had been established just inside the boundary of human space and was home to 50,000 people who had left Earth seeking a fresh start. Dr. Kevin Torres led an archaeological team that had been studying the planet's geology when they made a discovery that changed everything. Got deep beneath the surface of New Boston lay ruins older than any known civilization. The structures were made of materials that did not appear on any periodic table and covered with symbols that predated written language by millions of years. Dr. Torres sent excited reports back to Earth describing technology that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The Council's response was swift and harsh. Ancient ruins were considered dangerous by every species that had encountered them and were strictly forbidden to all but the most experienced archaeologists. The order came down immediately for all humans to withdraw from the site and allow Council experts to take over the investigation. Maya Thompson was Dr. Torres's partner in the dig, and she sent private messages to Amy describing what they had found. The ruins contained machines that still hummed with power after countless ages. Chambers filled with crystals that glowed with inner light stretched deep into the planet's core. Most amazing of all were the walls covered with star maps showing the galaxy as it had been in ages past. Dr. Torres refused to leave the site despite direct orders from both Earth and the Council. He argued that humanity had a right to study ruins found on their own world and that the artifacts could hold keys to understanding the galaxy's ancient history. His team continued working even as Council ships moved toward New Boston to enforce the evacuation order. Captain Sam Rodriguez commanded the defense platform that protected New Boston from pirates and raiders. When Kethmori battle cruisers arrived, in the system demanding that humans abandon the colony, Sam faced an impossible choice. His orders from Earth were to protect the colonists at all costs, but the Council had made it clear that resistance would mean expulsion from the galactic community. Amy watched the crisis unfold from Kepler Station while trying to find a diplomatic solution that would satisfy everyone. The Kethmori commander was a veteran warrior named Gorthak who had fought in border wars for over 2 centuries. He saw humanity's defiance as proof that they were no different from the ancient devourers that had once terrorized the galaxy. Ambassador Martinez worked around the clock trying to reach a compromise, but the position seemed impossible to bridge. The Council demanded complete human withdrawal from the archaeological site, while Earth insisted on their right to study ruins found on human territory. Neither side seemed willing to bend, and war began to look inevitable. Danny Walsh prepared the embassy's defenses while hoping they would not be needed. He had served in conflicts on Earth and knew how quickly diplomatic disputes could turn into shooting wars. The Kethmori were experienced fighters with ships and weapons far superior to anything humanity possessed, and a war with them would be over quickly. Dr. Torres sent one final message before communications from New Boston were cut off by Council jamming systems. He claimed to have activated some kind of beacon buried deep in the ruins and warned that something was responding from the dark spaces between stars. The message ended abruptly and all contact with the archaeological team was lost. Amy stood in the embassy's communications center listening to static from New Boston and wondering if humanity's dream of joining the galactic community was about to turn into a nightmare. Outside her window, the stars looked cold and hostile instead of welcoming, and she realized that some doors once opened could never be closed again. The Kethmori fleet held position around New Boston waiting for orders, while Council ships moved to support them. Captain Rodriguez prepared his small force for a battle. They could not win while 50,000 colonists looked to the sky and wondered if help would come, or if they had been abandoned by the species they had trusted with their lives. Amy knew that the next few hours would determine humanity's future among the stars. But she also suspected that something much larger and more dangerous than a diplomatic crisis was about to unfold. The beacon had been sleeping for 5 million years when Dr. Kevin Torres accidentally brought it back to life. Deep beneath the surface of New Boston, the ancient machine awakened with a pulse of energy that rippled across dimensions and reached into the darkest corners of the galaxy. Maya Thompson felt the ground shake beneath her feet as the archaeological site came alive with lights and sounds that belonged to a civilization older than the stars themselves. Torres stumbled backward from the control panel he had been studying when alien symbols began glowing with fierce intensity. The crystal formations throughout the ruins started singing in harmonies that human ears were never meant to hear, and the air itself seemed to thicken with power that made every hair on their bodies stand up straight. Maya grabbed Torres's arm and pulled him away from the awakening machinery, but they were already too late to stop what had begun. The signal traveled faster than light itself, crossing the galaxy in moments and penetrating the void between star systems where things had been waiting in the cold and dark for longer than anyone could imagine. Ancient ships stirred to life in the emptiness between worlds and began moving toward the source of the call that had finally come. The Devourers were waking up and they were hungry after their long sleep. Admiral Patrick Hayes received the first reports while reviewing fleet positions from his command center on Earth. Observation posts at the galaxy's edge had detected massive energy signatures moving through deep space toward inhabited systems. The readings made no sense according to known physics and suggested ships larger than anything in the Council database moving at speeds that should have been impossible, Captain Sam Rodriguez watched his sensors from the defense platform orbiting New Boston as space itself seemed to twist and bend around the archaeological site. The ruins were broadcasting something into the void, and whatever was listening had begun to answer. Sam tried to contact the dig team, but all communications were blocked by interference that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The Kethmori fleet commander Gorthak was the first to understand what was happening when his ship's ancient warning systems activated for the first time in 3,000 years. The battle cruiser's computers had been programmed by his ancestors to watch for specific energy patterns, and now they were screaming alerts in languages that predated his species. Gorthak had heard stories about the Devourers, but like most of his people, he had thought they were myths told to frighten children. Back on Kepler, Station Amy Peterson watched in growing horror as reports flooded in from across the galaxy. Entire star systems at the outer rim had gone silent in the space of hours, and the few escape pods that made it to safety brought stories that sounded like madness. Ships the size of moons emerging from the void and consuming everything in their path, including the light from stars themselves. The emergency council session was called within minutes of the first confirmed sighting, but the representatives who gathered in the great chamber seemed paralyzed by fear. The first speaker's silver skin had turned almost white, and her ancient eyes held terror that made Amy's blood run cold. The council had hoped never to see this day again, and most had believed the Devourers were extinct after the last great war that had nearly destroyed galactic civilization. Dr. Lisa Warren worked frantically with alien scientists to understand the data streaming in from the disaster zones, but the readings defied explanation. The Devourers appeared to consume not just matter and energy, but something deeper and more fundamental. Planets in their path did not just die, but seemed to fade from existence. As if they had never been there at all, Gorthak broke with protocol, and contacted Captain Rodriguez directly to warn him about what was coming. The Kethmori warrior explained that the Devourers had been defeated once before, but only after a war that lasted centuries and cost billions of lives. They had not been destroyed, but driven into the void between galaxies, where they had slept and grown and waited for the right moment to return. Chief Engineer Carlos Ruiz led a team of human and alien technicians trying to shut down the beacon on New Boston, but the ancient machinery resisted every attempt to turn it off. The device seemed to have been designed to be impossible to stop. Once activated, and the signal it sent grew stronger with each passing hour. Whatever civilization had built the ruins, they had apparently wanted to make sure their call for help would be heard across time and space. The first Devourer ship appeared at the edge of human space 3 days after the beacon activated, and what Rodriguez saw through his telescopes made him question his sanity. The vessel was black as the void itself and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Strange energies crawled across. Its hull, like living things in space itself, seemed to bend and twist around its massive bulk. The Zithari homeworld was the first major target, in Amy watched helplessly from Kepler Station as humanity's first alien friends sent desperate pleas for help. Their peaceful species had no weapons capable of fighting the Devourers, and their evacuation ships were too slow to escape the advancing darkness. The last transmission from their system was a message of forgiveness for humanity's role in awakening the ancient enemy. Dr. Torres and Maya Thompson were finally evacuated from New Boston as the planet's surface began to crack and bleed energy from the overloaded ruins. The archaeological team had documented everything they could, but their discoveries seemed meaningless in the face of the horror they had accidentally unleashed. Torres blamed himself for activating the beacon, but Maya reminded him that they had no way of knowing what would happen. The Council's response was swift and predictable, as species after species voted to abandon their outer territories and retreat toward the galactic core. The strategy had worked before when their ancestors had driven the Devourers into the void, but it meant sacrificing billions of beings who lived too far from safety to escape in time. Amy listened to the debates with growing disgust as supposedly civilized species argued about which worlds were worth saving. Admiral Hayes called an emergency meeting of all human military commanders as reports continued to pour in about the advancing Devourer fleet. Earth's navy was tiny compared to the forces arrayed against them, but Hayes had studied every available record of the ancient war and believed there might be another way to fight. The key was understanding not just what the Devourers were, but what they wanted and why they had come back now. The answer came from an unexpected source. When the ruins on New Boston finally went silent and released one last burst of information that Dr. Warren managed to decode. The beacon had not been a call for help, but a dinner bell, and the civilization that built it had been the Devourers' first victims. They had created the device as a trap to lure their enemies into the open when the time was right for the final harvest. As panic spread through Council space and evacuation fleets streamed toward the galactic core, Amy realized that humanity faced a choice that would define their species forever. They could join the retreat and hope the Devourers would be satisfied with the outer territories, or they could stand and fight against an enemy that had destroyed civilizations when humans were still learning to use fire. The decision came when the Zithari evacuation fleet was caught by Devourer scouts just hours away from safety, and their desperate final message reached every human ship and station simultaneously, asking why their friends had abandoned them to die alone in the dark. The message from the dying Zithari fleet reached President Victoria Cole while she stood in the Situation Room beneath Washington watching the galaxy burn on the main display. Every red dot represented a system that had gone dark, and there were far too many of them spreading like cancer toward the core worlds. The alien voices pleading for help in broken English made something inside her snap, and she knew that humanity would not run from this fight. Admiral Jake Morrison had been promoted after his return from First Contact, and now commanded humanity's growing space fleet from the orbital station above Earth. When Cole's orders came through the quantum communicator, Morrison felt his heart race with equal parts fear and pride. Humanity would stand against the Devourers, even if it meant standing alone, and he would lead the fleet that made that choice real. Captain LaVara Bennett received her new assignment while her ship was refueling at Luna Station, and she could hardly believe what she was reading. Instead of joining the evacuation of human colonies, she was ordered to gather every available vessel and head for the Outer Rim where the fighting was thickest. Her crew of the UES Defiance looked at her with expressions that mixed terror and determination when she announced their new mission over the ship's intercom. The first challenge was convincing other species to join the human fleet instead of continuing their retreat toward safety. Amy Peterson used her position at Kepler Station to reach out to military commanders who might be willing to fight, but most alien species had centuries of programming that told them to run from the Devourers rather than face them. The few who agreed to stay were either too proud to retreat or too slow to escape. Dr. Lisa Warren worked around the clock with Dr. Torres and Maya Thompson to understand the ancient technology they had recovered from New Boston before the planet fell. The ruins had contained more than just the beacon and some of the artifacts, seemed designed specifically to fight the kind of enemy that was now advancing through the galaxy. Warren began to suspect that the trap on New Boston had been more complex than anyone realized. Chief Engineer Carlos Ruiz led the effort to mass-produce weapons based on the ancient designs, and his factories on Luna worked day and night to equip the growing human fleet. The alien technology was beyond human understanding, but Ruiz and his team learned to copy it even if they could not fully comprehend how it worked. Every ship that joined Morrison's fleet was fitted with weapons that had been waiting 5 million years to be used again. Captain Sam Rodriguez brought his defense platform from New Boston loaded with refugees who had nowhere else to go and weapons that might actually hurt the Devourers. His small force joined with Captain Bennett's battle group, and together they formed the core of what would become the first integrated human-alien fleet in galactic history. The Kethmori warrior Gorthak surprised everyone by bringing 3 battle cruisers to join the humans instead of retreating. With the rest of his people, the first real test came at the Centauri gates, where a small Devourer scouting force had cornered a convoy of refugee ships from a dozen different species. Admiral Morrison led the attack personally in his flagship, UES Enterprise, while Bennett and Rodriguez coordinated the smaller vessels and hit and run attacks that confused the massive enemy ships. The battle was brutal and costly, but when it ended, the Devourers had lost 2 ships and the refugees were free. News of the victory spread through the galaxy faster than the evacuation fleets, and for the first time since the crisis began, some species started to hope that the ancient enemy could be beaten. More ships began joining Morrison's fleet and Alien. Volunteers arrived at human bases asking to serve on integrated crews that fought under human tactical doctrine. Amy Peterson found herself coordinating the largest military alliance in galactic history from her office on Kepler Station. Sergeant Danny Walsh trained the mixed crews in human fighting techniques that emphasize speed and adaptability over the rigid formations that most alien militaries preferred. The Devourers expected their enemies to fight like the ancient species that had fled from them before, but humans brought tactics that had never been used against them. Quick strikes and rapid retreats kept the enemy off balance while the integrated fleets learned to work together. Dr. Warren made a breakthrough when she realized that the ancient weapons were not just designed to destroy Devourer ships, but to disrupt the strange energy that allowed them to consume matter and space itself. The technology created fields that forced the enemy vessels back into normal physics where they could be damaged by conventional weapons. Warren's discovery led to the development of field generators that could protect entire fleets from the Devourer's most dangerous abilities. The major battle came when the main Devourer force reached the Vega system, where a large population of mixed species had been trapped by the speed of the enemy advance. Morrison knew that losing Vega would mean the fall of the entire Outer Rim and positioned his fleet to make a stand that would determine the fate of the galaxy. Over 300 ships from 24 species formed up under human command to face an enemy force 10 times their size. Captain Bennett led the first wave of fighters in an attack that seemed like suicide against the massive Devourer motherships, but the ancient weapons performed exactly as Warren had predicted. The enemy vessels found themselves unable to phase out of normal space, and their hulls began taking damage from concentrated human firepower. For the first time in 5 million years, the Devourers faced an enemy that could actually hurt them. The battle raged for 6 hours and cost the Allied fleet nearly half their ships, but when the smoke cleared, the Devourer force was in retreat and Vega was saved. More importantly, word of the victory reached species throughout the galaxy, and the great evacuation slowed as military commanders began to reconsider the wisdom of abandoning their territories without a fight. Gorthak sent a message to his people, explaining that humans had shown them something they had forgotten in their long history of wars. Sometimes the greatest honor came not from winning battles, but from choosing which battles were worth fighting, regardless of the odds. His words carried weight among the warrior clans, and soon Kethmori battle groups began leaving the evacuation fleets to join Morrison's growing armada. Amy Peterson coordinated the integration of new alien forces into the human command structure while dealing with Council representatives who demanded that humanity stop their reckless attacks and return to the approved strategy of retreat. She politely informed them that humanity had withdrawn from the Council's authority and would make their own decisions about how to fight for their survival and the survival of their friends. President Cole addressed the galaxy from the steps of the Capitol building in Washington with words that would be remembered for centuries. She declared that humanity had learned something important from their brief time among the stars, and that lesson was simple: no one should have to face the dark alone. Earth would not abandon its allies, and any species willing to fight for freedom was welcome to stand with them. As more ships arrived to join the fleet and more species chose to fight rather than flee, Morrison realized that humanity had accidentally started something that would change the galaxy forever. They had shown that the Devourers could be beaten and that retreat was not the only option when faced with an impossible enemy. The legend of humanity's refusal to give up was spreading through the stars and inspiring others to find their own courage in the face of ancient fear. Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the greatest fleet in galactic history form up for the final push toward the core worlds. Ships from 40 different species flew in formations that would have been impossible just months before, and each vessel carried weapons designed by human engineers working with alien scientists. The integrated command structure he had created was about to face its ultimate test against an enemy that had never been truly defeated. Captain Sophie Clark commanded the GCS Unity, which had become a symbol of the new alliance between species. Her crew included beings from 8 different worlds working together under tactical doctrines that combined the best ideas from every member species. The Unity served as the prototype for hundreds of similar vessels that proved mixed crews could outfight any single species navy when properly trained and equipped. The Devourers had not been idle during the months of human victories at the Outer Rim, and their main force was now moving toward the galactic core in a formation that stretched across dozens of star systems. Long-range sensors showed motherships, the size of small moons surrounded by escort fleets that numbered in the thousands. The enemy had committed everything to this final assault, and Admiral Morrison knew the coming battle would determine the fate of every thinking being in the galaxy. Dr. Lisa Warren and Maya Thompson had established their research center on the mobile command station that followed the fleet, and their work had led to weapons that could actually damage the Devourer vessels. The ancient technology from New Boston, combined with human innovation, had produced energy fields that forced the enemy ships to remain in normal space, where they could be destroyed by conventional weapons. Every ship in Morrison's fleet carried these field generators, along with the improved weapon systems that Carlos Ruiz had designed. Chief Engineer Ruiz worked with alien technicians to solve the logistical nightmare of keeping hundreds of different ship types supplied and operational during a campaign that had already lasted months. Human manufacturing techniques combined with alien materials science had created supply lines that could support the largest military operation in recorded history. The fleet carried enough ammunition and spare parts to fight a war that might last years if necessary. The first phase of the final campaign began when Captain Lovra Bennett led a strike force to rescue the survivors of the Zathari homeworld who had been trapped on their moon base when their system fell. The mission was supposed to be a simple evacuation, but Bennett discovered that the Devourers were using captured beings as some kind of fuel for their ships. The sight of her friends being consumed to power enemy vessels filled Bennett with a rage that would drive her through the battles to come. Captain Sam Rodriguez commanded the defense of the Kepler system when the Devourer advance guard arrived, and his mixed force of human and alien vessels gave the enemy their first taste of the new tactics that Morrison's fleet had perfected. Rodriguez used the system's asteroid belt as cover while his ships hit the enemy with coordinated strikes that targeted their ability to phase out of normal space. The battle lasted 3 days, but when it ended, the Devourers had lost more ships than in any previous engagement. Sergeant Danny Walsh had trained thousands of alien warriors in human combat techniques, and now those lessons were being tested in battles across dozens of systems. The Kethmori had adopted human squad tactics, while the Tenthari learned human strategies for ship-to-ship combat. Even species that had been pacifists for centuries were learning to fight with a ferocity that surprised everyone, including themselves. Amy Peterson coordinated the intelligence network that tracked Devourer movements and fed tactical information to fleet commanders throughout the war zone. Her work from Kepler Station had become the nerve center for the largest military operation in galactic history, and the data she collected showed that the enemy was following patterns that could be predicted and exploited. The Devourers had not changed their tactics in 5 million years, and that might be their weakness. The critical breakthrough came when Dr. Warren realized that the Devourers were not just consuming matter and energy, but were actually feeding on the life force of entire civilizations. The ancient weapons were designed to disrupt this feeding process and force the enemy back into normal physics where they became vulnerable. Warren's discovery led to the development of new tactics that focused on protecting civilian populations while destroying the enemy's ability to sustain themselves. The main battle began when the Devourer fleet reached the Council Nexus, where the core worlds had formed their last line of defense. Admiral Morrison positioned his forces to intercept the enemy before they could reach the heavily populated systems, but he knew that failure here would mean the end of galactic civilization. Over 2,000 Allied ships faced an enemy force that outnumbered them 5-1 in a battle that would be remembered for millennia. Captain Clark led the Unity and her squadron in the opening attack that was designed to test the enemy's new formations and identify weak points that could be exploited. The Devourers had learned from their previous defeats, and their motherships were now protected by energy shields that seemed to absorb the ancient weapons without taking damage. For a terrifying moment, it seemed that the enemy had found a way to counter humanity's technological advantages. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. When Gorthak's battlecruiser managed to penetrate the enemy formation and discover that the shields were powered by captured beings held in the mothership's cores. The Kethmori warrior transmitted this information to Morrison just before his ship was destroyed by concentrated Devour fire, and his sacrifice gave the Allied fleet the key they needed to win the battle. Captain Bennett volunteered to lead a desperate mission to penetrate the largest mothership and rescue the beings whose life force powered the enemy shields. Her ship, the UES Defiance, was fitted with experimental phase generators that would allow her to pass through the mothership's hull, but the technology was untested, and there was no guarantee that she would be able to escape once inside. The assault on the mothership became the turning point of the entire war when Bennett's team discovered thousands of beings from dozens of species being held in stasis chambers that fed their life energy into the ship's systems. The rescue operation was a nightmare of running battles through corridors filled with devourer creatures, but Bennett and her crew managed to free enough captives to cause a cascade failure in the mothership's shields. Admiral Morrison coordinated the final assault on the unprotected motherships, while Captain Rodriguez led the evacuation of the freed prisoners and Captain Clark protected the rescue ships from devourer fighters. The battle raged across the entire system as more motherships lost their shields and became vulnerable to the concentrated firepower of the Allied fleet. The war ended when the last devourer mothership was destroyed, and its explosion created a shockwave that could be seen from planets dozens of light years away. The ancient enemy that had terrorized the galaxy for millions of years was finally extinct, and the survivors of their fleet fled into the void between galaxies, never to return. Captain Bennett did not survive to see the victory her sacrifice had made possible, but her name would be remembered wherever beings spoke of courage and honor. In the aftermath of the greatest battle in galactic history, Admiral Morrison found himself commanding a fleet that represented every species in known space and had proven that unity was stronger than any single enemy the galaxy was free from. The Devourer threat, but the cost had been enormous, and the work of rebuilding would take generations to complete. 5 years had passed since the last Devourer mothership exploded in the fires of its own destruction, and the galaxy was still learning how to live without the shadow of ancient fear hanging over every world. Admiral Jake Morrison walked through the halls of the new council chambers on the rebuilt station at the Galactic Nexus and marveled at how much had changed since the first meeting, when humanity was seen as a dangerous newcomer to the stars. The Galactic Council had been reformed, with humanity holding not just a seat but the position of First Marshal responsible for the defense of all member worlds. Morrison wore the silver badge of his office with pride and humility, knowing that it represented the sacrifice of thousands of beings who had died to win the freedom that all species now enjoyed. The old restrictions on human expansion had been lifted and replaced with invitations to establish colonies wherever they were needed most. Captain Sophie Clark commanded the new Galactic Defense Force from her flagship, the GCS Harmony, which served as the mobile headquarters for fleets that patrolled the borders of known space. Her crew still included beings from dozens of worlds, but now they served as teachers and trainers for the integrated forces that protected every system. The tactics developed during the war had become standard doctrine, and young officers from every species learned human strategies alongside their own traditional methods. Dr. Lisa Warren stood at the podium in the great lecture hall of the Interspecies Research Institute on the rebuilt world of New Boston and looked out at an audience that included students from 40 different species. Her work decoding the ancient technology had led to breakthroughs in science and medicine that benefited Everyone and the Institute had become the premier center for cooperative research in the galaxy. The ruins that had once threatened to destroy everything were now preserved as a memorial and source of knowledge. The Memorial Gardens on New Boston had been designed by Maya Thompson, who had survived the evacuation of the archaeological site and returned to help rebuild what the Devourers had destroyed. Each species that had fought in the war was represented by plants and stones from their homeworlds, and at the center stood a simple monument listing the names of all who had died to protect the galaxy. Captain Lavarbonet's name was carved in letters of gold at the top of the memorial, and fresh flowers were placed there every day by visitors from across the stars. Chief Engineer Carlos Ruiz managed the vast shipyards that orbited Earth and produced the vessels that carried explorers and colonists to new worlds throughout the galaxy. His factories had been converted from making weapons of war to building tools of peace, but they still incorporated the hybrid technology that combined human innovation with alien science. Every ship that left Earth carried the best ideas from every member species and served as a symbol of cooperation rather than conquest. President Victoria Cole had been re-elected twice since the end of the war, and her approval ratings remained high among both humans and aliens who saw her as the leader, who had made the choice to stand and fight when retreat seemed like the only option. She spent her days working with the Council on projects that would have seemed impossible just years before, including the first truly interstellar colonies, where beings from multiple species lived and worked together as neighbors and friends. Amy Peterson had left her position at Kepler Station to become Earth's ambassador to the Reformed Council, and her office in the new chambers was always busy with representatives seeking advice on everything from trade agreements to military cooperation. The diplomatic skills she had learned during the crisis had made her one of the most respected figures in galactic politics, and her memoirs about humanity's first contact with alien civilization had become required reading for diplomats throughout. Known space. Captain Sam Rodriguez commanded the memorial fleet that traveled between systems carrying supplies to worlds still recovering from the war, and messages of hope to species that had lost so much during the dark years. His ships were crewed by volunteers from every world, and their mission was to prove that the victory over the Devourers had been worth the price paid for it. Wherever the memorial fleet appeared, children would gather to hear stories about the humans who had refused to abandon their friends. Sergeant Danny Walsh ran the military academy on Luna, where officers from every species learned to work together, using the integrated command structure that had won the war. His students included young humans who dreamed of exploring the stars and alien cadets who wanted to serve in the fleets that protected their worlds. Walsh took pride in seeing beings who had once been enemies working side by side to prepare for threats that might never come but would be met with unity if they did. The galaxy had grown larger and safer in the years since the war, as exploration fleets pushed the boundaries of known space and established contact with species that had been isolated by fear of the Devourers. Each new world that joined the Council brought fresh ideas and perspectives that enriched the community of thinking beings. Trade routes connected systems that had never known of each other's existence, and cultural exchanges brought art and music and literature from hundreds of worlds to audiences eager for new experiences. Dr. Kevin Torres had returned to New Boston to serve as director of the Memorial Research Center, where teams of scientists worked to understand the full history of the galaxy's ancient civilizations. His accidental activation of the beacon that awakened the Devourers had saved the galaxy by forcing the final confrontation that ended their threat forever. Torres often wondered if the builders of the beacon had somehow known that their trap would eventually serve a greater purpose than they could have imagined. On worlds throughout the galaxy, parents told their children bedtime stories about the species that had come from a small blue world and taught the stars themselves the meaning of courage. The humans in these stories were larger-than-life figures who fought monsters and saved civilizations, but the real humans who heard these tales knew that they were just ordinary people who had made an extraordinary choice when it mattered most. Ambassador Helen Martinez addressed the graduation ceremony at the Memorial Academy as hundreds of young beings prepared to take their places in the fleets and colonies that would shape the galaxy's future. She looked out at faces that represented dozens of species and told them that they were inheriting a universe where anything was possible because their predecessors had proven that some battles were worth fighting no matter how impossible they seemed. The stars looked different now to anyone who understood what had been won among them. They no longer held the cold light of distant suns, but the warm glow of homes where billions of thinking beings lived free from ancient fears. Ships moved between them, carrying explorers and traders and students eager to learn about worlds they had never seen. The galaxy had become what it was always meant to be, a community of species working together to build something greater than any of them could achieve alone. As new exploration fleets prepared to venture beyond the edge of known space carrying crews from every world, Admiral Morrison knew that humanity's greatest achievement had not been defeating an ancient enemy, but proving that courage and hope could triumph over despair and fear. The legend of the species that refused to give up would inspire new generations to reach for distant stars without hesitation, because they knew that no one would ever have to face the darkness alone again.